morning, everyone. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you today on WJOP FM 96.3 on Channel 9 and on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm delighted this morning to welcome James Kimmel Jr. here to talk to us about the psychology of grievance. James is a lecturer in psychiatry at the Yale University School of Medicine. He's also co-director of the Yale Collaborative for Motive Control Studies. He's a violence researcher with a specialty in the role of grievances and retaliation in violent crime. And he's also a novelist. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to talk a little bit about his intriguingly titled thriller, The Trial of the Fallen Angels, at the end of our show today. James, first of all, welcome to the morning show, and thank you so much for taking time to visit us today to talk about this important research.
Thank you, Mary. It's my honor and pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you and your audience.
Well, I appreciate your taking the time to do it, James, very much. I found out about you and your research from an opinion piece that you had written for Politico about the link between addiction and grievance and its connection to violence. And I found your piece to be both fascinating and illuminating. Grievance remains so much in the news these days as a political tool, especially in the wake of the big lie and the January 6th insurrection. And it just remains a huge part of our political life. The former president, for example, recently announced in front of CPAC to a receptive audience, "I am your retribution," which underscores just the extent and the range and the depth of grievance among segments of our population. You have a way of describing the dynamics of grievance, the brain biology that it's rooted in, that I find both simultaneously humane and humanizing, but of course it's also disturbing because of the way grievance is connected to violence. We can't fix something that we don't fully understand, it strikes me, but thankfully you and your research help us to chart a way toward both understanding and a path, hopefully, to address the problem. So first, James, I was hoping we could begin with you just giving us a definition of grievance.
Yeah, so maybe I can start by just talking about, the three quiet scientific breakthroughs that have brought us to this point of insight. So the first is that there's been a convergence of data from the FBI, the Secret Service, behavioral research studies, and other researchers around the world that have now converged to say that the most common motive for all forms of violence is grievance-triggered retaliation, right? So it's grievances that lead to the desire for revenge. That's an important initial finding, and if you think about that, that is something that we can see throughout history from the beginnings of recorded humankind, really, in terms of retaliation in response to something that we feel is unjust or is some form of mistreatment. The second quiet breakthrough that's happened recently is in neuroscience, and neuroscience brain imaging shows that your brain on revenge, right? Your brain on revenge triggered by a grievance looks actually like your brain on drugs. So grievances or people with grievances seem biologically, at least, to crave revenge the way, a heroin addict craves heroin. Yeah. So we have this combination of law enforcement and public health and behavioral data saying that revenge is the root motive for violence. And now we have a bit better of an understanding of why or how that could be. Why do we, for instance, if we feel wronged, why do we want to retaliate? Our brain could be wired to want us to have cotton candy, right? I mean, we could want something wonderful to make ourselves feel better. But what happens with a grievance, and to get to your question of the definition of a grievance, the definition of a grievance is a real or imagined perception of mistreatment or injustice or victimization. That's what the definition of a grievance is. And when we have one of those in our lives, whether it's personal or political or a workplace grievance or romantic or economic or racial, religious, whatever they are, it's almost an infinite number of potential grievances that humanity or individuals can hold at any one time. Whatever your grievance is, though, that's what a grievance is. And now we begin to know that it triggers this craving, this very strong compulsion to retaliate against either the person or organization who caused your pain or their proxies. It turns out, and we can talk about this a little later, humans get retaliation or revenge in many ways, and often it's not against the actual source of the grievance, it's against some individual or animal or object that stands as the proxy for the source of your victimization.
This explains so much human behavior and human history, James. It's such a pivotal idea. And I think I'm so grateful for the research that you and others have done to help us understand in a comprehensive, synthetic way the drivers of violence, especially what you were just saying about it doesn't have to be the individual that you perceive. And let's underline perception here, because like most things in life, it's in the eye of the beholder, what is humiliating or what is hurtful. And some people are likely more prone to perceive a hurt and humiliation and to feel that way. I suspect often family background is related to that. But what it does is then when the perception gets formed that you have a grievance against somebody or something, the craving for retaliation begins to hurt back. And it doesn't have to be the particular individual. It could be, as you say, a proxy, somebody who represents, or in your mind is associated with the person that has done you wrong. Have I understood you, James?
Yeah, you've put it very beautifully there and very accurately, I believe. That's consistent with what we see in the research. And then the third quiet scientific breakthrough that's happened is that we now have, at least we've developed, in my the Collaborative for Motive Control Studies at Yale, we've developed a process by which these grievance revenge cravings can be released safely so that we can reduce the revenge craving without acting out the retaliation in real life. So we now have what it appears to be and what is forming to be a pathward toward a true public health approach to violence reduction by focusing on this pathway, the reward pathway of the brain, which is the addiction pathway, or often known as the addiction pathway, where these areas of the brain activate to stimulate craving and habit-forming behavior in anticipation of relief of pain or some feeling of euphoria or joy. Not everyone feels euphoria and joy when they get revenge, but often they do. There is a high that comes from it. But just like other addictions, the high is very short-lived. The pain returns, often worse, because now by retaliating, you're in a position in which, well, first of all, by becoming the instrument of someone else's suffering, you have to experience that suffering. I use the analogy of a hammer striking a nail cannot avoid the impact of the blow, right? So if you're the hammer, there's no way for you as a hammer to not experience that impact. And then secondarily, you get the revenge cycle going in which you're seeking justice, and justice is really often in modern times, the polite, politically correct word we use for revenge or retaliation. But your effort to get justice for yourself is the victimization and grievance for the person that you've just done that to. And so we now have this grievance cycle going where I'm getting justice, or I think I am, by retaliating. You're reading that as more injustice and victimization to yourself. And so you then, of course, want to get justice back at me. And this is how all violence, other than rooted in some sort of true psychopathology. But almost all violence in human history, warfare, interpersonal violence, starts and ends in this way. And I do want to just make one other point, which is it's not only about violence. So we're talking about violence because that's the worst outcome of retaliation, right? And it's the one that's in the news, and it's the one that results in people's lives being lost or people being harmed and maimed and lives destroyed. But you can also, all of this applies to nonviolent retaliation, whether it's a tweet, an unkind tweet, or whether it's an unkind word to somebody, or pulling away from someone who's harmed us, or planning or plotting or even imagining some way of retaliating against them that doesn't get carried out. All of those forms of retaliation are bound up in this same process.
Mm-hmm. So it doesn't have to be physical violence. There are forms of emotional, let's call it emotional violence as well, like anonymous death threats or harassment, or things that are set up to emotionally or wound or humiliate people. Those also fit within the same kind of brain neural pathways that you're talking about, which it's
or also shouting at somebody or cussing somebody out, or malign, defaming, or maligning them or trying to embarrass or humiliate them online or in a conversation. All of that is part of this.
Yeah. And then what's also fascinating to me about what you're describing is the ripple effect. Because you can find, you're craving for retaliation if you're the one harboring the grievance, maybe settle down in a transient way. But after you've yelled at somebody or pushed them or hit them or shoved them or called in a death threat, that's a grievance to them. I mean, it's going to trigger that we're all human. And so it's going to start triggering the same neural pathways and the craving for some kind of retaliation or revenge, even if we're thinking of it as justice in certain cases, it can register as a grievance, and then it gets this ripple effect that is kind of explains human history, James, doesn't it?
Right. And if we bring it up to modern times, the big X factor that hasn't been part of human history until very recently is the advent of social networks. And these social networks are able to transmit grievance from one person to millions of others very rapidly. And so they're not only a delivery system for feeling victimized or unfairly treated, and this could be your own victimization or victimization of your group or your tribe, your type of people, whoever they might be. So it's not limited to just yourself. It could be your family, your community, your race, your religion, whatever it is. So you can experience it that way. But social networks and the internet are able to deliver those grievances and spread them to many more people more rapidly than at any time in human history, infecting millions at once. And then the other aspect, the dangerous aspect of the social network that humanity hasn't faced before, is that the social networking also becomes the vehicle for delivering the retaliation as well. So you can not only, you can feel victimized and then respond instantly with, an unkind tweet or some sort of a trolling experience. You can also use the social network to plan out, outside of the virtual world, more physical acts of retaliation. So all of this is the new stuff that humanity's never had to face before, and has suddenly been dumped in all of our laps in pretty recent order. And we even, as you mentioned, the former president, a master of using social networking to spread his grievances and also to use the social networks as a means of retaliating or encouraging others to retaliate. And this, knowing that this is part of an addictive process, suggests that it's particularly dangerous, and it's not limited to the former president. That's just a great prominent example, but it afflicts millions of us daily in all sorts of ways. personally and corporately.
Yeah. What you're saying is of great concern, and it's also fascinating, James, because earlier you were talking about how the person that we might target for retaliation, it doesn't have to be the individual or group, it can be by proxy. And what you're talking about is the power of social networks to spread grievance by proxy. And so that all we need really is to identify with the person who is feeling aggrieved. And if we recognize some aspect of ourselves or some justice we feel that we've been hurt or harmed by, then the grievance can spread in this, I guess viral is a perhaps appropriate way to talk about these forces at work. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, and it relates to, I think, what we were just talking about with social networks, but it's the role of environmental cues. Because one of the things I was interested in the article you wrote was you talked about the role that we know environmental cues play in alcohol and substance abuse, for example. It's known that if you're in a place where drugs are being taken or sold, or you're around people who are using drugs, that can create a dopamine surge that reinforces those cravings for the substance you're addicted to. Could you talk about how these environmental cues work with grievance addiction? What kinds of environmental cues can trigger those kinds of cravings?
Well, it seems to be that with regard to, the grievance revenge cycle and thinking of revenge as or justice seeking or revenge seeking as an addiction type of behavior. The cue in that process is actually the grievance itself. So the grievances come from your environment, right? I mean, whether it's a person who's, sitting next to you or somebody on the internet or anywhere else in your life, the perception, and I think it was what you said was important earlier in our discussion. Grievances are something that we perceive. They can be real and they can be imagined as well, entirely imagined. And it doesn't matter at all in terms of activating this revenge craving process. Yeah. So it may be that, and what you believe was an insult or a humiliation, a panel of 1,000 people might have witnessed that same thing and might go, I didn't even know there was an insult or humiliation involved here. What's the problem? But if it's real for you, that's all that matters, period. If it's real for you, then you feel that you've been victimized, and this starts that process. So the cue appears to be that perception, real or imagined, of some form of betrayal, harm, humiliation, injustice, or mistreatment, whatever it might be, as you see it. And once you've seen that cue, and this is, I think it's true as well with substance use cues. Different cues impact different people with substance use disorders differently. Yeah. Some people won't react to a certain type of cue at all, and others will almost always all react to a different type of cue. For instance, as you said, seeing drug paraphernalia often is triggering for people who have significant substance use disorders in terms of triggering the craving process. So with regard to grievances, that is the primary cue. Now, it's important to discuss just how broad grievances can be. So just the mere feeling of dysphoria or, a perception, an internal feeling of sadness or pain, even physical pain from an illness, can trigger a desire to want to retaliate against something to make this pain go away. And that's really seems to be what is at the root of, or at the end goal of this process of grievance retaliation, is to make the pain stop. That's the pain of the victimization. That's what the person who uses revenge or retaliation is seeking, is some way of making the pain that they've experienced end. And the perception or the belief is that if we retaliate and inflict pain on someone else, the person who actually inflicted that pain or the proxy, we will feel better. And it's a flawed belief, but we're unfortunately hardwired to do this. And that's what this brain biology seems to teach us, is that, humans throughout recorded time have been hardwired in our brains to seek retaliation in order to make ourselves feel better in part.
There's a real pathos to that, as you describe it, James, because we're wired to believe, or to feel anyway, that if we push outward against someone else or something else, then we will relieve ourselves of the pain we're carrying, either present or something in memory that we carried, a humiliation that we remember that torments us from the past. And yet it doesn't work. It's only short-lived, and a transient nanosecond, maybe, because we'll be distracted by even the physical movement outwards if we're being violent, or the activity of yelling, as you said. But it doesn't work. In fact, it just reinforces the need to do something. What we're really looking for is relief from what we're craving. What we're craving is relief from the pain that we're carrying. So there is a kind of well, I said pathos before, but it's really seems tragedy in the classical Greek sense of the word.
Right.
So,
Right. Well, if you think about it, the logic of it, there is a certain logic to it. It's an economic model of logic. I often describe it this way. We all wake up each day with what we think is our treasure of happiness in our wallet or in our purse, right? As we open our eyes in the morning, we often hope, we're at maybe a moment of contentness, right? Because the day hasn't begun. Our brain maybe hasn't activated to think about problems in our lives. So we're at a state of peace, perhaps. And then our day begins, and we may encounter somebody or something that causes us pain or a feeling of mistreatment. So let's say that it's very common, you're driving to work or wherever you have to go, and somebody cuts you off in traffic. And now the process starts. This was unfair and unjust. This hurts me. I need to make this pain go away. What really has happened, I believe, is that you reached into my wallet or my purse and you stole a chunk of my happiness, and you just drove off with it down the road in your selfish manner, you person who just cut me off. So it makes logic sense to go and chase that person down if happiness were a commodity like gold or silver, and go, I'll just go and chase that person down and I'll get my happiness back. I'm just going to take it right back. When you get there, of course, you realize they don't have your happiness. They only have their own happiness. And so then the logic becomes, well, if I take some of their happiness, I'll refill my wallet or purse by getting it from them. The flaw, of course, is that happiness isn't external. It's not gold, silver, or money. It's a state of mind that you self-create. And that if it goes away, you can create more infinitely if you choose to. And there is a process for doing this, but that process isn't achieved by inflicting pain or cutting that driver off to get your happiness back, because what you soon realize is you're only even more angry, more upset. You now put yourself and other people in harm's way, and they're now probably trying to cut you off again.
Yeah. And in addition to that, James, the consequences of acting out your craving through an act of like road rage, for example, as you were talking about, is that in an instant, you can do something that creates enormous harm and disruption for yourself. If you hurt someone physically or that somebody is harmed, you'll be arrested for that. And people will not be sympathetic to road ragers because we're all afraid of that. And then, so, in terms of mapping out some of the harms of this cycle, it's harmful to everyone, really, the individual who acts it out for all kinds of reasons, because you can, not just disrupt, but really seriously damage your life. You can hurt somebody else, sometimes in permanent ways. People have died in road rage incidents. Then you'll go to jail, and your family or anybody who depends on you. So it is, once again, that ripple effect that goes outward, and we all suffer from this phenomenon. And so, we have talked about grievance addiction as it is a political tool, and we've certainly touched upon other aspects. But James, in the article you mentioned, and I think it's important to understand how this cycle affects other realms of life, such as intimate partner violence, police brutality. Could you talk a little bit about, I know it's more than we can deal with, and I may have you come back, but I just wanted you to map out for us the range of areas of life that this grievance and revenge addiction impacts, how it shows up in other ways, because people may not have connected the dots before.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a good point. The research shows that for all forms of violence, and that includes, intimate partner violence, youth violence, and bullying as well, street and gang violence, mass shootings, police brutality, and violent extremism. All of these forms of violence have at their root a perception of a grievance or victimization, followed by a craving for revenge. So criminologists for a long time, many years, decades, I believe, have observed, but haven't really been able to explain why it is that in populations, people who've been victimized also are observed to be perpetrators and or become perpetrators. The perception is that there's a connection between, there's a victim offender overlap, it's called in criminology, and this helps explain why and how that is. People who are going to perpetrate see themselves first as victims, almost in all cases.
Yeah.
There's a sense that I've been a victim, I will now perpetrate, but they don't see it as perpetration of a crime. They see it as justice seeking.
Yeah.
I've been harmed, I want justice, I'm going to get justice. Sometimes we do it in socially acceptable means, which are nonviolent, or even violent if we use, the court system which is, the socially authorized process for inflicting violence and physical harm on people who have, committed perpetration of things that society wants not to happen.
Yeah.
So all of these forms of violence have at their root this perception of grievance, and that includes, you think of police. Well, how is that possible for police brutality? Police, perhaps as an occupation, experience more grievance than maybe any other occupation in society, because they're always the subject of somebody that they perceive as trying to attack and harm them, maybe kill them.
Yeah.
Very tough job.
Yeah.
And yet we don't really educate and train and arm our police to manage these intense, grievances that they experience, physical harm, verbal abuse, and enable them to manage those in such a way that they don't become the perpetrator of the next act of violence. So that is one example. In domestic partner situations and intimate partner violence, same thing. A lot of focus has been made on, it's all about kind of male, typically male, obviously, are perpetrators, and it's about male power seeking. But really below that is not really male power seeking. What the research shows is that men believe or perceive themselves to have been victimized, some form of humiliation or betrayal. And it doesn't have to be, the intimate partner went and had a relationship with somebody else, although that's hugely potent and triggering. But any form of humiliation in an intimate relationship where you love someone is a very powerful grievance for somebody.
Yeah.
And if the individual who's experienced that doesn't have the skills and or the, as you mentioned, whether they had the family resources, genetics is going to play a role in this at some level. Whether they were raised in a family where when there was a humiliation, there was physical violence that followed it, and they were essentially trained from a very young age that this is how you do it. This is how you make yourself feel better. This is what you do to people in an intimate relationship who humiliate you. This same kind of process starts, and it seems as though it can be habit forming, like drug addiction or other behavioral addictions like gambling or sex addiction or gaming addiction. All of these things can become reinforcing, in which the behavior is repeated and learned. And it may be, although there's no evidence of this yet, but it may be that as is observed with various forms of drug addiction, that there may be a tolerance that you develop. In other words, you need a more potent retaliation to get the same effect that used to be. It used to be enough to just yell, right? Now it's going to need a physical act, and maybe then that's going to become even more and more severe and more violent, up through and including the use of lethal force. So it's amazing, here we are in 2023, and we're just now learning all of this. And then the question becomes how can we use this to reduce all of these forms of violence and nonviolent retaliation? And I believe that we're on the way to developing a true public health model that can do that. And that's part of the promise of seeing this in an addiction frame, is that by using that, we understand pretty well now addiction. Billions and billions of dollars have been poured into addiction prevention and treatment over the last 30, 40 years. Lots of advances have been made in science, AA types of things, of self-help and faith-based programming, other therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy and motivational interviewing. Also, pharmaceuticals have been developed that can help control the cravings, which it hasn't been studied yet, but may end up playing a role for revenge cravings for people who really struggle with it. It might be able to reduce that revenge craving. So using a public health, addiction-informed prevention and treatment approach may reduce the violence that we're experiencing in our society, separate and apart from trying to control, access to weapons. Access to weapons reducing access to weapons, especially those that can kill many fast, makes all the sense in the world. But we also can now bring a public health approach to bear, where we're also, and that's why the collaborative that I lead is called the Collaborative for Motive Control Studies. Motive control as contrasted with gun control. I think we can do something to help control the desire to kill, in addition to helping to control access to the means to kill many fast.
Well, James, please then tell us about, because when I read about the motive control treatment strategy, the public health approach that you talked about, I thought it was really fascinating. I had some questions I wanted to ask you about it, but tell us what you do in I think you call it the non-justice system, with the imaginary trials. So tell us about that treatment strategy, what happens, and the impact that you've observed it having on people who experience it.
Sure. So the perception has always been, if you want justice or retaliation, you need to carry that out in the physical world. But the insight from this research is that this is all happening inside your brain. So when you've been victimized, if I insulted you, Mary, right now, that would be a present pain, but that would quickly move into the past. And if we weren't recorded, and this was just you and I, and there were no witnesses to it, only you and I might know that it had occurred. So it's only lingering in your mind, but it's in the past, right? It's no longer present in your existence, but yet it's still causing you pain. Inside your mind, you're creating this desire to retaliate against me. That's also purely inside your brain. So the idea occurred to me years ago: what if we, instead of forcing people or only making available to individuals a trial that's in the real world with lawyers and judges in a courtroom that's very expensive, limited access, often biased, all sorts of difficulties with it. what if we could just allow people to experience a very real trial inside their mind where they get to put the person who wronged them through a complete trial, but the victim plays all the roles. You play yourself, the victim, you play the defendant who hurt you. So you play that role, you play the judge and jury, you play the administrator of punishment. But in a last step that I call the final judgment, you sort of then take a 50,000-foot view of the whole situation, and you become the judge of your own self, and you're given the opportunity to set yourself free from the pain of the past and from these revenge cravings. And so we've studied that at Yale. We've had study subjects go through who've had grievances, go through this process, and it turns out we're able to measure revenge desires before and after. And so far, the data have shown that revenge cravings are reduced dramatically by going through this imaginary mock trial of your perpetrator, and you get to call all of the shots. It's very safe because the perpetrator isn't in the room. You're playing the perpetrator, and it's very fast and it's free, right? I mean, it's just really, you don't need a lawyer, you don't need a judge, you don't need a courtroom. Everything you need is actually, it turns out, right inside your head, right where your memory of the pain exists and where your craving to retaliate in the future exists. So by putting everything together there, it seems like we're able to reduce revenge craving, and we haven't been able to do long-term studies beyond a few weeks or a few months. But in those studies, it shows that the effect does seem to continue. It seems to last. It may be that you need a booster of this or something, but it does seem to work. And we've also adapted it as a group model in which we infect an entire group of people with the same one grievance. So we're able to do that very quickly by having everyone imagine that they have a beloved pet who is killed by a neighbor. So the neighbor is the perpetrator, the person who wronged them. They all experience the same grievance, and then we take the entire group through these steps of the trial. And that seems to have similar revenge reduction effect. And it also it's also a way of teaching and training people how quickly grievances arise, how absolutely fast and powerful they are at taking over and hijacking your brain and leading you to a retaliatory act. So that's it in a nutshell.
Well, you just answered the questions I had about, because the initial article I read, I didn't understand how comprehensive the role plays were, that you're really causing people to use their imagination and use different parts of their brain. They're not trapped within the revenge cycle because they're having to imagine all the different roles, including the person they feel aggrieved by, the judge, the jury. And then it's really interesting that you end with a very comprehensive kind of long range view. And there's nothing quite so restorative of sanity as asking yourself to take a long range stance, or almost a metaphysical kind of view of your human condition. And so that seems brilliant to me, James. And I can understand why it would have a comprehensive and hopefully very long lasting impact, because you're also changing people's ability to use their brains in different ways, and not to get trapped in being kind of trapped within their immediate instincts, but to learn to take that pause, perhaps, and to think differently. It reminds me that one of the things you talked about in the article was how you think it's really important that we have more public education at every level, from childhood on through adulthood, about healthy ways to deal with feelings of hurt and humiliation. And clearly that's what you're creating. You're creating healthier ways through this mode of control public health approach, which is very encouraging. Are there other, just to see if you have anything else to expand upon in terms of how to teach people healthy ways to deal with times when they feel hurt or humiliated?
Right. Well, this process, I often think of this process as methadone for a revenge addict, or
Yeah.
methadone for a justice addict, in which the reason it seems to be effective is it does allow you to get revenge at first, to imagine it. By getting this, imagining that you've convicted the person who hurt you and that now you get to sentence them
Yeah.
and you get to carry out the sentence, you get to do it all. And by doing this, you're getting that safer, smaller taste of revenge that releases the pain for you for a moment. So it's initially provocative, and then you experience the retaliation. You feel a little bit better because now that's suddenly released, but then you start to feel worse again. And it leads you into this final step in which it turns out that practicing what I call non-justice, which is to say, not seeking justice in the form of revenge, is you begin to see for yourself by going through that process of retaliating and experiencing it all. You see that all you did was make yourself feel worse and worse throughout the process. Even the infliction of revenge, which you thought would feel so good, doesn't really feel good when you're the one doing it all the way through. Right. And it begins to dawn on you. One is not seeking justice in the form of revenge is better for me. It's in my own self-interest as the victim. And this opens the door to, and to answer your question, the number one thing that people can do to eliminate the pain of all grievances of the past, whatever they are, is to forgive, not in an open way to make the perpetrator feel better. Forgiveness is the ultimate healing drug for any grievance that you have. When you focus on the idea of forgiving it as a decision to no longer allow it to hurt you. And that means that you've forgiven it, you've put it into your past, and you're no longer going to allow it to infect and ruin your present and your future. So it's an act of self-healing, not of grace for the person that harmed you, although you can make it into that too, if you wish, but it's not necessary. The most essential thing about forgiveness is to see it as the way of healing yourself from any of the pains that you're carrying around from the past. And this helps make that more clear and easier to accomplish.
That's very profound, James. I love the way you talk about forgiveness. Forgiveness is really freedom for ourselves. And to the extent, as you were saying eloquently before, that happiness is an inner state, it means that we have more control and power to cultivate our own happiness through freedom. And it strikes me, means that we limit the power and control that other people can have over us. The more that we are able to assume control over our own state of mind and our own emotions, the more it won't matter as much to us what anybody else does, because it's really all about themselves anyway, whatever they're doing or whatever they're saying. So thank you for that. That's very profound, James, and it helps me understand more. One of the things I'd wanted to ask you too is you end the article that I was so impacted by making a strong statement that we all have a role to play in halting the cycle of grievance and retaliation, both clearly for ourselves and also as a society. And you talk about the importance of bringing compassion to addicts. And I understand much better now that you have described what the cycle is and how pervasive it is in all of our lives. That if we understand that grievance and retaliation are grounded in pain and feelings of hurt and humiliation and very misguided and sometimes often instinctual strategies for what we think is going to make us feel better, that just makes the problem so much worse. And so thank you for that. It helps me understand. Is there something else you'd like to say about why you think it's so important for us to bring an attitude fundamentally of compassion to something that is, addictions are diseases, and we understand that better now? Certainly in terms of addiction to substances or gambling than we used to. And now you're bringing an awareness of this emotional cycle. Is there anything else you'd like to say, James, about the importance of adopting an attitude of compassion?
Well, let's start it with self-compassion. So all of this is about healing yourself. And we can, we can begin to look at even this process, the grievance retaliatory process, is also leading to self-harm, right? To either self-injury that's non-lethal and up through, even suicide, which is to say that we sometimes feel that we are our greatest perpetrator in our lives, that we've done things that are unacceptable or unforgivable, or we've let ourselves down, or we've let others down. And we carry this burden and we develop the desire to retaliate against our own selves.
Yeah.
And I believe that, this same concept of non-justice and then forgiveness, which, as you said, it truly is freeing and empowering. In our society, the idea of forgiveness is often considered sort of the weak strategy, the weak approach, the thing that only the weak people do. And it's quite the opposite. It's the most powerful thing you can do for the reason you said, which is you're taking back control of your mind and you're taking that from other people. And that includes taking control of your own mind in terms of potential self-loathing as well.
Yeah.
And I think that people who, are, caught up in that process can find a path towards using this, put yourself on trial if you need to. And, wherein you're the perpetrator and the victim, and you'll come to the conclusion at the end that that the pain will go away if you're able to forgive yourself, to not seek justice against yourself. The pain does release. I just think of forgiveness as, the true miracle drug that works wonders, and it's available to everyone for free. You don't need a prescription for it. You just need to use it, and use it correctly. I mean, this is kind of the correct, powerful way to use it. So,
it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
Well, James, it's just wonderful to talk to you. I can't finish with you today, though. I do want to ask you about your intriguingly titled novel. I see you have if people are watching on TV, they'll be able to see you have a copy of The Trial of Fallen Angels, a thriller behind you. And it was, I should add, and congratulations, an Amazon editor's pick. Just tell us a little bit about it.
Well, it's really the dramatization and fictionalization of everything that we've just spoken about. So what I wanted to do to try and work it out for myself and to help make it more accessible and understandable for others is to imagine the most extreme case of justice and revenge addiction that I could imagine. And the one that I could imagine that was the most extreme is to be a lawyer of souls in the afterlife, in which the main character, whose name is Breck, is this young attorney in real life who was murdered, and finds herself in the afterlife being assigned to represent killers at the final judgment, and at the same time to have to solve the mystery of her own death. Which is why, how did she get to be there in this kind of legal purgatory where the final judgment occurs? And I don't want to say a lot more than that.
No spoilers.
In terms of spoiling it, but the in terms of what we've been talking about, she has to deal with her own very intense revenge desires and the revenge desires of others. And it's it addresses the question, it's scaled in the afterlife, but it could be in this life as well, which is, what price do we pay to continue to carry grudges and to try and actually, get revenge for them and not allow ourselves to have happiness or freedom unless and until we do. So that's what's at stake there.
It sounds very intriguing and totally relevant to everything that we've been talking about this morning, James. Thank you for that.
Sure.
We've been talking to James Kimmel Jr. this morning about the psychology of grievance. And one last question for you, James. Are there resources that you would recommend for people who might have been listening and gotten more intrigued and more interested in the profound ideas that you're talking about?
Yeah, so there's a website called savingcain.org. That's SAVINGCAIN, as in Cain and Abel, savingcain.org. And that's the first internet website. I created this in 2015. It's the first and maybe still the only in which I used a suicide prevention website model to actually make a resource available for individuals who are considering acts of violence, including up through and including mass shootings, to understand what's going on in their brain at that moment, and maybe to provide them with a set of resources that can help them take a different path before it's too late. That website has links to various resources, and it talks about the idea of revenge attacks in the way that the American Heart Association talks about heart attacks, which is we ought to know if we ourselves or somebody we know or love is experiencing the signs of a revenge attack, which for violence have been identified by the FBI and the Secret Service, grievances that are getting worse, expressions of rage and that don't resolve, talking about revenge, threats to kill, acquiring access to weapons, identifying targets, and preparing to hurt or kill. Those are the signs of a revenge attack. You got to call 911. It's a life-threatening condition for that individual and their potential victims. So that's outlined there, as well as access to a new app that I've created called the Miracle Court app, which is this entire imaginary trial process that we've been discussing, Mary. That's all available in a free app that's audio driven. So you're led through the entire trial and all 5 steps of the trial, right in your headphones on a smartphone. So there are some resources like that, and that's probably the #1 best location to get that information. Also, and that's probably, I'd say that's where people ought to go.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, James.
Sure.
Well, James, first and foremost, thank you for the work that you do, the research and the treatment strategies, which sound, it's such a profound way of understanding our humanity and our history, what the dangers are and what the possibilities for healing and freedom are. So thank you for all the work that you've done on that. And secondarily, thank you so much for taking time to spend with us and share your research and your ideas and your eloquence on the morning show. I truly appreciate it. Thank you, James.
Thanks, Mary. It was a real pleasure and honor, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Pleasure and honor, all mine. Thank you so much. Well, that's it for today, everybody. Please join us again next Thursday at 9 for the morning show. Till then, be well, be at peace, forgive yourself. Bye, everybody.